was somebody's shoulder discharge, surgery, shoulder discharge.
Good morning.
2013.
If I hold it up here, can you hear me okay?
And I still don't know what they did, but my portal was
Good to have you all here. People are still coming in.
It was on my phone, but not on my
And there's some room at the front. One thing about Lutheran Church, you always know there's room at the front. Let's begin with a prayer. Gracious God, in the season of Advent and expectation, we thank you for the light, both the light of your Son and the light the Son brings us this day. We thank you for hearing from Vern and on his progress of recovery, and we continue to remember him as well. So bless us in our gathering and in our preparation for Christmas. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So I was asked to do something on Christmas and popular culture, and I'm here to say there is no war on Christmas. Is that clear to everybody? A few years ago at a Christmas party at Augsburg, the then president asked a Hindu professor of business, well, it's Christmas, what should I say to you? What would be appropriate? And he said, you could say Merry Christmas. I'm sorry, Fred, that's how he sounded. And I suppose we have to think about what's appropriate, but I thought of something how popular culture has shaped who we are and what we do, and so I began with Sunday school programs. So, you know what they are? So I thought, cue the angels and the friendly beasts. I think friendly beasts might be one of the first carols I taught my own children. So, and we'll talk about St. Francis and a little bit of, in Rochester, you have to always talk about St. Francis. So I'm Joel Quanbeck II. I am a Zumbro member, as listed in the program. Signal and noise, this is what we're going to talk about, where we'll begin and end. Christmas story is not the key story for early Christianity. It only comes in later. And it's still not the key story for Christianity. I want you to all know that. What's the key story? Easter. And I think all the Christmas stories are modulated, apocalyptic versions of the Easter story put in a way that's palatable to us. But I'll explain that later. The celebration of Christmas has always been a mixture of the sacred and secular. There is never a once upon a time when Christmas was virtuous and clean. Despite what they tell you on the Hallmark Channel. Christmas story and its celebration is a collection of stories. It is a story, but there are stories leading up to it and stories that follow. And how do we celebrate Christmas for ourselves, our faith, our community, and our world? So we'll think a little bit about the worldwide perspective. So I'm going to move quickly here, or I hope to. My wife tells me I go too slowly sometimes. I thought I'd begin here. This is at the Children's Theater Company where we are going to How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and that is Ruth with our grandchildren. Okay, is this a secular event? Yes. Is it a good event? Yes. Can you do both? Yes. This is a lefse making kit. This is the lefse starter kit. Does this have anything to do with the birth of Jesus? Does it have a lot to do with our celebration of Christmas in our community? Yes. Is that okay? Yes. Just don't confuse the two. The earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark were actually written on lefse. Okay, this is a processional of the Christmas program 2 years ago at Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Minneapolis, where our grandchildren go. And what do you see there? Shepherds with staves. How many of you have been a shepherd in a Christmas program? Is that all? Oh my goodness. How many have been an angel? Yeah. So and here's kind of the scope. The angels, the kings, the queens, Mary, Joseph. The baby in Jesus is not in this shot. But what do? We involve children and ourselves in the telling of the story. What did Pastor Jason do this morning? He put on the same outfit and played a prophet. I could not do things like that barefoot anymore, but... Okay, just go through quickly. Christmas is not part of the major celebrations of the early church in the first 3 centuries. So the earliest Christians did not celebrate Christmas. They celebrated Easter, as we already reviewed. I have to make sure I get there. So let's go roughly through the Gospel and what they say about Christmas. The Gospel of Mark is my favorite Christmas story. There is no Christmas story in the Gospel of Mark. If you had the Gospel of Mark, you wouldn't even have heard of Bethlehem. Joseph is not mentioned as the father of Jesus, and there's no birth story. I'll get back to that later. The Gospel of Matthew has a genealogy which brings us to Joseph, the husband of Mary. Remember, we go through all those begats, which are made fun of, but they're actually really an interesting, serious discussion. So, and you get down to Joseph, and then it says, the husband of Mary, to whom Jesus was born. All that. And it doesn't say Joseph begat Jesus. Yeah. Boy, pay attention now. And in Matthew, we get the wise men, or the magi. Okay? 3 kings, does it say that?
No.
Does it say 3?
No.
No. It just says gifts. We'll get back to that later. There are 3 gifts. The Gospel of Luke, the angel Gabriel appears to Mary. The journey to Bethlehem. Okay, now Bethlehem appears. Mary is of the lineage of David. No, it's not Joseph, it's Mary in Luke. Which one's right? If we're playing the which one's right game, we're heading down the wrong path. What's the most important story at Christmas? Easter. Joseph plays a minor role, and who shows up? Kings, magi, wise men, shepherds. Okay, in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul wrote to the Galatians, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law. Who's the woman? Paul never says. Where was he born? Doesn't say. Okay, I'm really disappointing you so far. Well, let's jump ahead. The early church in the 4th centuries and into the 5th centuries began to celebrate the Feast of the Epiphany, and this is when the church started taking shape, growing, and becoming official, and it had places to worship. It had a clergy that dressed in Roman-style robes. But let's get to the place where the nativity scene comes into play. St. Francis of Assisi at Greccio in 1223 CE. Francis, you all heard of St. Francis? He plays a big role in Rochester. Francis is a 13th century monk who takes a vow of poverty. He journeys to the Holy Land, and he goes to the place where Jesus was born, which had become a place of pilgrimage, a place in Bethlehem. Okay, do we know for sure? We just know it's an ancient place for pilgrimage that goes back to the 4th century. Francis goes back to Italy, and he thinks the poor people can't all make a pilgrimage. So what does he do? Does he make them go to Bethlehem? He brings Bethlehem to them. And it's in the 13th century when Francis of Assisi dreams up this thing that we call a nativity scene with Mary and Joseph and the baby and animals. Because he wants to emphasize that this is in a manger, which is in a barn, which is, Francis had it in a cave. So Francis is motivated by pilgrimage, and for him, he wanted to bring the pilgrimage to people. I think there's a brilliance to Francis. He's not as good as Luther, but he's getting there. And then we have paintings then of the birth scene, and actually following Francis's example, we get art as well as life portrayals, and everybody paints themselves into the manger scene. Is that what we've been doing in a way? It is. Is that okay? Yeah. I mean, this is where culture and religion come in. We can Because I think enacting stories is a way of telling them, and you will remember that you were part of a story, even if you weren't the one who told it. Better keep going here. And so, this is a heretical scene, because who do you see in this creche? We call it a creche, nativity. How many have nativity scenes at home? Good. How many have more than one? Okay. How many have 3? If you want to buy good olive wood carved nativity scenes, we know a great shop in Bethlehem to go. Right, Joanne?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, what we call a nativity scene is actually a blend of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke and a bunch of other stuff thrown in like animals. Do you explain to your children that this is really not an appropriate scene that doesn't reflect either one of the Gospels appropriately? No, we don't. I explain that to you, and you can live in the dilemma. So the Friendly Beasts is a 13th century French song. Jesus, our brother, kind and good, was humbly born in a stable rude, and the friendly beasts around him stood. Jesus, our brother, kind and good. What does this do? It involves the singer with the figure of Jesus. What's the language used? It's relational language, fictive kinship language. Is Jesus literally our brother? Does this help the parishioner, the believer, relate to the figure of Jesus? I think the story of the empty tomb, which I think is the original Christmas story, is too powerful to get all at once. And in a way, we need to translate that apocalyptic experience into ways that are acceptable and approachable. And this is a way of doing it. And notice how it even claims animals. Moving along. Okay, here's where the secular really enters into the secular and the sacred. Winter parties. Ever been to one? Yeah. Okay. That's a picture Ruth took at me of one of our early parties. The Saturnalia Festival was a midwinter, Decemberish kind of party in Rome where role reversal took place. There was the fake king for a day who might be a slave, and the slave would be the master, and the master would be a slave. And there was a role reversal, kind of a celebration, a lot of drinking, and partying. And why is winter a good time for that? It's near the winter solstice. And so the days are getting shorter, but what's going to happen? It's going to get longer. Do you feel that when that happens? I do. Anyway, I'm not recommending that you do this, but... And so here's another picture. This is in color. Ruth also took this of me in another office party. Those of us of Scandinavian tradition, Yule. Is that a Christian word? No, it is a pagan term. Those of us from Norway, our ancestors were quite pagan until they saw the Viking show. The Yule log and trees were an important part of pagan winter worship. And the Yule log would burn for days, and they would use the embers to start other fires. The oak was important for Odin and for Thor, and then the fir tree comes along as a sign of spring and eternal life. So those symbols, trees, the oak, the fir, the fire, and drinking, were all part of that Scandinavian winter festival. Now, does the church ask people to abandon all celebration of winter? No. What does it do? It co-opts it. Now, there's always a risk. But here we'll enter into a new kind of celebration. Thor had his goats, by the way, with a flying chariot. Huh. Makes you think. And then Odin had a flying horse named, anybody know the name of Odin's horse? Sleipnir. And had 8 legs and flew. Oh yeah, do you hear? We can't establish a direct connection, but kind of semi-divine figures with flying animals comes well before Santa. And sacred oak trees, the oak and the fir, as I mentioned, were part of Nordic winter celebrations. The date we have for Christmas is arbitrary. Is it the actual birthday of Jesus? No. It is related to the Roman celebrations, and it was a merger of the early church set January 6th as Epiphany, and so the date for Christmas got to be established as December 25th, which on the old calendar was roughly approximate to the winter solstice. So is there a pagan origin to this date? Yeah. Can we live with that? Yeah. And then there's winter celebrations. This, of course, is a Carl Larsson portrayal of a true Swedish dinner. Have you all been to the American Swedish Institute? Yes. It's just such a great display. We go frequently. Ruth is Swedish, I'm Norwegian, but I must admit the Swedes have a much higher culture. The American Swedish Institute, it's right on, is it Park? 2600 Park Avenue. It's right near a Lutheran Social Service. Yeah, we can go, I'll show you. I know my way around the city. And, what's the record store that's not far away?
Electric Fetus.
Electric Fetus is not far away, yeah. Thank you, Jason. He's always looking for original Led Zeppelin albums. The way we celebrate Christmas was not always this way. It was brought to us both by Scandinavian and German Lutherans, but also by Victoria and Albert. Albert was the German. Have you all seen Victoria on? Okay. We've watched it twice, I think. And they brought Christmas to England, and then the Americans wanted to copy, so they brought the notion of a tree and small presents, not big presents, a smallish tree, and then it got larger. So that's where bringing the tree into the house. The tree isn't simply outside. What does it do? It imports the outside in. And so now the pagan festival becomes domesticated, and you put ornaments on the tree, and are they kind of Christian ornaments or lights and things like that? And that's the way we then appropriate and draw that. I'm sorry, I'm hitting the microphone too hard. We do have to talk about Santa Claus. You all know the song, Here Comes Santa Claus? Yeah. Just sad. The notion of Santa Claus begins with Nicholas, Bishop of Myra, or Myra, in what would today be modern Turkey, in the 4th century. So he is a bishop, and he's usually portrayed in bishop's robes, and he became the patron saint, as a friend of mine wrote, Bruce Forbes, in his book, the patron saint of almost everything. He was the protector of sailors and crusaders. And the feast day for Nicholas was December 6th. Now, and here's the interesting thing. Christmas is a birthday, but usually the church celebrates death days. So saints' days are usually the days the saints died, not when the saints were born. And so this would be, he is regarded as a martyr. That's an actual photograph of Nicholas. Yeah, it's a selfie. The figure of Santa Claus then becomes adapted in the 17th and 18th centuries by artists for commercial purposes. And in a way, the original Santa was a protector of children and of sailors and of crusaders. On their way to the Crusades, the sailors would often stop by the grave of St. Nicholas. He had been sainted, and seek a blessing before they would go on their way. Then Nicholas became a guide for small children on how to behave. The naughty or nice thing. Going to find out who's naughty and nice. How many have lived in terror of that? But that was really the notion of St. Nicholas as a judge, someone who discerns. So what's the goal actually is to encourage good behavior. And so some of the early Santa portrayals in the United States were actually to try to get youth to behave. And so there was a social agenda with Santa Claus. Who knew, right? And then the night before Christmas, Clement Moore. How many of you know that poem? It was the night before. Can we all say it together? That is one of the best known poems in the United States. and many people can recite it by memory. What does that tell you? It tells you about the cultural penetration of a popular notion. And do you remember that in the poem, Santa Claus is described as an elf, not as an adult? And how big are the reindeer? Tiny. Tiny reindeer and an elf. Now that can be kind of scary. And he comes into your home without your expecting it. But we can thank the Coca-Cola Company. As we get into the 30s and the 40s, Santa now moves from being a protector and a moral guide to an Epicurean. No, Santa becomes the provider of gifts. And that actually is a fairly recent development. And the notion of initially before 1850, gifts were small. But in the late 1900s or 1800s, you get the notion of larger gifts, and then companies promoting that. F.W. Woolworth actually were the people who created the notion of sending letters to the North Pole. You all remember Woolworth, right? One of the many retailers that's gone to the great retail beyond. And letters to the North Pole, and what other things needed to grow with the growth of gifts? Wrapping paper. That became big business. And greeting cards. And have you all got your cards done? Yep. I haven't even started. So what are we saying? Santa Claus has evolved from a saintly figure in bishops' robes and hats. What does this Santa look like? The red suit. And so is this culturally acceptable? In a way, but here we can even say a positive thing. Santa has moved from an austere and maybe stern religious figure to a generous cultural figure. But do we associate positive values still with the Santa? We do. Yeah. So in a way you can think of the Santa Claus as someone who crosses cultural boundaries. Because you can go to Japan and see Santa. Right?
And the old Soviet Union.
And in the old Soviet Union. I was in the old Soviet Union in 1973 in a labor camp in Siberia. No. I was on a college trip. And we arrive, it's early January, and here's Father Frost. And there's a Santa Claus still in the non-religious Soviet Union. They couldn't get rid of Santa Claus. Just think of that. So they still, at that point, had a lingering effect. We have to have a special place for Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Have you all heard of that? How many of you have actually read the book? Okay. Have you seen any of the movies? What's that? And plays. On the play at the Guthrie, the Alistair Sim black and white movie, how many versions of it? This is a ghost story. What's interesting is in Scandinavian and Northern European winter celebrations, it was also a time for ghost stories. And so the notion of the magical and the ghost is not alien from the mid-winter celebration. And Dickens isn't really describing Christmas the way it was. His is really a tract to argue how Christmas might be. So think of this as moral education in mid-19th century England in a culture that he thought was adrift. And so this is, in a sense, an attempt to shape cultural notions of what Christmas is. When Scrooge wakes up on Christmas morning and looks out the window and sees a boy in the street and he says, is that turkey still available, or that goose or whatever still available at the butcher shop down the street? What does that tell you about cultural life in England in that day? Stores were open on Christmas. It wasn't a holiday. And you notice there's little mention of religion in the entire book, though at the end Scrooge goes to church. One sentence. So this is an attempt to transform society and say there is a place for caring for the poor what else does it, why is it a positive story? It talks about personal transformation. And don't people like stories of personal transformation? And so that's very powerful. So Scrooge is haunted, but in a way redeemed by the visit from the Spirit. So it's a ghost story that turns out to be a positive ghost story. And again, is this something that crosses religious and cultural lines? I think it is. Think how it plays at the Guthrie, sold out until, and how the Scrooge figure has really come into culture. The Grinch is a Scrooge. And often you have movies where you have people who are hateful, resentful, and go through some kind of transformation. So Scrooge becomes a model for a kind of midwinter Christmas transformation and the notion of Christmas spirit. Now we can be a little cautious about the use of the word spirit because it's amorphous and not tied to anything particular, but on the other hand, can people feel a Christmas spirit without being part of a Christian community? I think we have that in our culture, and maybe we should I think we do recognize that, but see that as a positive rather than a negative. And Tiny Tim, God bless us, everyone. So read this aloud and have a good cry. Okay, a little bit about songs of Christmas. I could have spent more time on this. I'm going to invite you to throw out some of your favorites here. We have Christmas carols, Away in a Manger. Everybody know that one? Which tune do you like better? I like Forest Glen or whatever. Silent Night, again a German. Notice how carols come from other languages often into English, so we translate them. And then From Heaven Above is Martin Luther's Christmas song, From Himmel hoch doch komme ich her. From heaven above to earth I come. And he basically goes through the letter to the Romans in the entire psalm. So how did Martin Luther use Christmas carols?
Teach theology.
To teach and preach. And what's the thing about songs? They stay with you. Yeah, did Luther know what he was doing? Oh my goodness. I keep discovering more about that. So Luther would use songs and Christmas songs to teach the Christmas story so that people, children and adults, could remember them. Now, one thing I wonder is, our children remember, most of you remember Christmas carols, right? I'm not going to test you, but what are some of your favorites? And what's a carol as opposed to a popular song? Anybody?
Royal David City.
Once in Royal David City. That was the prelude today, and I'm going to mention that at the very end here, why that's a significant song. That's very powerful. What are you connected with? Lessons and carols at King's College in Cambridge on Christmas Eve. But I notice it's not once upon a time in David City, it's once in Royal David City. Notice the historical particularity there. What other some carols?
Je er så glad.
Je er så glad til julen, Ben. Okay, some of us know what we mean, and we're the inner circle. I am so glad each Christmas Eve. Again, we sing that. Do we sing that in our church? Sometimes. I know we sing it in my family at Thanksgiving and at Christmas. And at Augsburg College and at St. Olaf. We sing that. Yeah.
Daily Gör den Himmelblå. Daily Gör den Himmelblå.
Daily Gör den
And that's
Himmelblå.
from home. And Mom would sing that. So you would, I remember that.
And the English for that would be? Bright and glorious is the sky?
Right.
That's Swedish that you're speaking there.
That's right.
Yeah. That's why I didn't understand it right away. Yeah. Oh, little town of Bethlehem, Phillips Brooks. And that created a notion of Bethlehem, didn't it? How still we see thee lie above thy deep and dreamless sleep, the silent stars go by. Had he ever been to Bethlehem? Have you, but had Phillips Brooks?
Nope.
I don't think so. Anybody been to Bethlehem lately? It's nothing like the song. You have to go through a large gate with military, with weapons to get into it. It's no little town, and it doesn't lie silently. Is it still important, though? It is. So notice we have places and stories that go with the songs. Then there are popular songs. I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas. Anybody know that one? How many what's that? It's the most popular Christmas song. See that? It's written by a Jew, Irving Berlin, written by a Russian Jewish immigrant. I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas. Is that cross-cultural? What's reflected in the notion of a white Christmas? Northern Europe. They have a problem in Australia at Christmas because can you dream of a white Christmas in Sydney? So some of our notions of what constitutes Christmas are latitude specific. And you can get snow in Jerusalem in January, December. That's not impossible. I've been in it. It's just not very pleasant. And I wouldn't dream of it there. I'll Be Home for Christmas is kind of a World War II song. What does that reflect? It's still sung, but what does that reflect? Longing for home, which is the theme of a lot of popular Christmas songs. A longing for home. Christmas movies.
Oh, yeah.
White Christmas. Paul.
There is somebody that I know very intimately who just popped out. Grandma got run over.
Grandma got run over by a reindeer.
Yeah, so
I think they're singing that at the second service. What does that tell you? I think it's funny. If I can find a recording, I'll buy it. I collect that kind of thing. What does that tell you?
It shows how far we've come.
It shows our moral progress as a civilization. It's also a critique of, let's say, overly weaning, things that get treacle-laden songs. So maybe it's a positive critique. White Christmas was actually the third movie that had the song in it. The first one was Holiday Hotel. Holiday Inn. Which was about an inn only open on holidays. You know what this is. What is this? It's a Wonderful Life. A box office failure, but an eternal success. This is associated with Christmas. What makes it powerful? Again, it's a story of transformation and personal despair. He's visited by an angel, which is the equivalent of a ghost in the story, and he sees an alternative life. And who redeems him in the end? The community. Love and community. So notice the only religion part in there, there's no priest and often you don't have clergy figures enter in, but you have an angel, and what's his name? Clarence. And he's out to earn his wings. So there's a works righteousness. But it's popular because it's a story of redemption. Again, does this reach out beyond church walls? It does. So is this something we can have a conversation with people about and how they experience the film? I think you can, and I would suggest doing that. This classic, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And who plays the narrator snowman in the film? Brill Ives, thank you. This is 50 years old. It was just on last night. And how, see, it's still playing. What was it like to watch it again? It brings back memories. And what is it a story? As someone wrote, it's the story of the redemption of the differently abled. So Rudolph is the red-nosed reindeer, which makes him different. And in the end, his difference makes a difference. So do children like to hear that story? Does that capture something true about Christmas without being explicit? I think it does. Then you have the island of what? Misfit toys. Oh dear. And notice the evolution of the Santa Claus figure here.
Looks like they're
Another one, Miracle on 34th Street. This is a psychological thriller. Again, who wins in this movie? The culture does. So it's the notion of gift giving, and you have a well-meaning man who thinks he's Santa Claus. And does that generally work, though? It does. And it's about a store named Macy's, by the way. They're on 34th Street. A Christmas Story. I think this was based on a Gene Shepard story, if any of you know who he was. He was a radio guy in New York. And this was a pursuit for, anybody know Christmas Story? Mm-hmm. It was on last night. Notice they play this stuff again and again and again. And what was that like for you? Did you watch it or have you seen it? Okay. Every year. Yeah, this is the kind of stuff we watch every year. And what was that like for you?
Fun.
It is fun. And it brings us back to childhood. So there's a lot of revival of notions of childhood. Now, nostalgia can be a dangerous thing. It can subvert anger. It can also have a sense of loss. We would hope it brings a sense of redemption as well. I like the movie. And then there's the Hallmark Channel.
Love stars.
Yeah. Entertaining. This is your B-movie actors from the 80s and 90s come back on the Hallmark Channel. You'll know if you look. I've switched back and forth between the two Hallmark stations, and two movies at the same time were ending with Christmas weddings.
Yeah.
Everybody's in pursuit of the perfect Christmas and the perfect gift. And so, while there is a notion of Christmas spirit, I think there is a haunting problem with perfection, because everything has to be right, which I think is a problem. I don't think everything has to be right. Yeah, they're scrupulous about mentioning any religious connection. They don't mention anything about religion, nothing about Jesus, and they always talk about the true meaning of Christmas, which is, and there are always bits of Christmas songs playing in the background. Not that we ever watch it. Jim and I sit and watch hours of this together and complain. Is there a podcast about it?
Where they go with for 70 minutes, they review one of those movies.
Really?
Yeah.
In a positive way?
No.
There's a podcast that reviews those Hallmark movies at length. And I think the podcast is something like Mystery Science Theater. Would that be accurate? I mentioned the Charlie Brown Christmas special, which I think is really a cultural high mark. This is based on the work of Charles Schulz. And what is famous about this? Linus's soliloquy. There are two things. The Christmas story is recited from Luke's Gospel, I think, for about 14 verses, with nothing else. Nothing else. So of the TV specials, this is the one that is most explicitly biblical, and if you watch it, you will have heard a portion of the Gospel of Luke. And then there is the tree. Hallmark Channel, they're looking for the perfect tree. What do they find here? An imperfect tree. And it's a way of redemption of the imperfect. So I really I show this in class, actually. It's long before my students were ever born. And I said, there used to be this show called Peanuts. I also explained to them, there used to be a guy named John Wayne. I'll wrap it up shortly here. and the cultural influence of the service of 9 lessons and carols from King's College in Cambridge. I have never been to the service, though I listen to it every year. I first got acquainted with it on vinyl albums. And when I was 15, I was with my dad at Evensong in King's College at Easter. So that's why I've been in the chapel and I've heard the choir, and it was transformative. The first service of 9 lessons and carols was on Christmas Eve, 1918. Does that ring a bell? This is, what, 6-7 weeks after the end of what had been the bloodiest, deadliest war in the history of the world up to that point. And the devastation of the culture of England and the loss of young men was incredible. And that Christmas Eve was the first service of 9 lessons and carols. And it begins with the story of Adam and Eve and then proceeds to the redemption story. And it starts with what hymn? Once in Royal David City. Not in that poor lonely stable with the oxen standing by, we will see a bud in heaven set at God's right hand on high. When like stars, his children crowned, all in white will wait around. That's the final verse. That's the apocalyptic of Christmas, the apocalyptic of the resurrection, captured in a Christmas carol. And that's what starts the service. I think it's an incredible, they have new stuff every year, but there always starts with Once in Royal David City. And it's always the same lessons. And it always starts with the creation and fall. And it is broadcast around the world on BBC and Minnesota Public Radio. And does that become a cross-cultural experience? I think it does. So I would bring that in as one of my final things here in terms of this has become part of popular culture. It is part of kind of classical culture, but it's really because of the BBC part of world culture. So, a few final things to wrap up. Christmas and our neighbors. So we live in a diverse community, right? And can we say Merry Christmas? Yeah. Do we have friends and neighbors? We do, who don't celebrate Christmas. Pardon me. We have a Jewish dentist nearby who always brings everybody in the neighborhood brownies at Christmas. Is that the spirit of Christmas? Yeah. And can we show ecumenical friendship at Christmas? I think so. Do Muslims think Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary? They do. Oh. If you go to the Church of the Nativity and down to the place where Jesus was born, he was born on a silver star laid in granite. Will you find Muslims down there with a sense of awe as well? You will. So Christmas is not necessarily a time of exclusion, it's a time of connection. I asked my Muslim students about it and they thought that was true. Maybe not celebrated in the same way, but is it something that we should at least know? I think it is something we should know. I think I've got one more slide. So, what can we do? What's my prescription? Everybody go to hear the Bach Society and Lyric Concert do the Christmas oratorio. What can we do? First of all, I think as a church, one of the worst things that happens is in our culture, Christmas begins in September. And when does it end? 5 p.m. on December 25th. It ends at Christmas. And I think that is, if there's a cultural thing that bothers me, it's the notion that Christmas is over and everything goes on sale like the Mensch on a bench. Did I show you that? I'll show you my toys here. And everything goes on sale and you're already into New Year's and then the Valentine's come up. Do we have to, that's a cultural signal, do we have to live by that signal? No. I don't think we do. I think the best thing, this is what I like about the Christmas oratorio, it starts with Advent, continues through Christmas, and it ends with Epiphany. the notion of 12 days of Christmas wasn't part of the original early church. It evolved as the date for Christmas was connected between the Western Latin Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so you have this 12 days that stretch from Christmas to what was more important in the Eastern Church, Epiphany. And it's a feast day. And so I think we don't have to expect the society to support us in that, but we can say, you know what? Christmas is not over at midnight on the 25th. In a sense, that's the beginning. Because what's Christmas really about? The resurrection. And as I gave my chapel talk at Augsburg last week on the Advent text, I had Mark 16, the empty tomb story, where the women run from the tomb and said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. I scared my audience. But I said, that's the birth story of the birth stories. So Mark does have a birth story. It gives birth to the other birth stories. And in a way, we do a great thing here because we mark Christmas in this church, and the worship service we have, and the celebrations we have, the bazaar, is that part of a community connection with the celebration? And even making lefse, I think, communicates something about the gospel. Once you put sugar and butter on it. A little cinnamon. So I think we engage the culture. The culture, we can't control the culture. It's going to celebrate Christmas however it wants and make the money it wants. And is that all bad? No. But how do we celebrate Christmas? We know what it's about, and we can mark it in this congregation by saying Christmas isn't over on the 25th. It continues on to Epiphany at least. So anyway, do I have another slide? I think that's it. Yay, we're done. I brought my toys, a plastic nativity set, so I can reenact this at home. My Playmobil 3 wise men. Some think there was a fourth. And then you've heard of Elf on a Shelf? Yeah. Well, this is the Jewish combination, the mensch on a bench. I got this on sale at Target, 70% off. Such a deal, I said. I gotta have one. Anyway, so I hope I've engaged popular culture with you. Our time is about up. Any questions or comments before we end today? I really appreciate your being here. Thoughts? Yes.
We were at the Rochester Symphony concert last night, and one of the carols they sang, which I cannot remember the name right now, but it describes the baby Jesus as being rosy and white.
Yes.
And that's how, an example you kind of talked about earlier, about we do sort of co-opt our cultural or our own cultural background to make it fit.
We have made the Jesus story, and Jesus looked like us. And we painted ourselves into the scene, which I think is okay, but then we painted Jesus to be like us, and that's always a risk. And so Jesus as rosy and white is certainly a Northern European ideal. And Jesus wasn't born in Northern Europe. Yeah, Mr. Wilkinson, Dr. Wilkinson.
You want to any comment on the reported war on Christmas and any one way or the other?
The war on Christmas, I think, is manufactured. It's an offshoot of the political correctness discussion. I think it's one thing to just assault people with Christmas. But again, when we deal culturally with Christmas, the notion of the spirit of Christmas is a way we can talk. We can talk about what Christmas means to me. I really think that's a manufactured. Bill O'Reilly, God rest his soul. Well, he's still around. I hope he finds eternal rest sometime. The coffee cups at Starbucks. With what? Oh yeah, the pagan coffee cups at Starbucks. There's always been a pagan aspect to the Christmas celebration. And are we free to celebrate Christmas here? Yeah. Are there some places where they're not? Yes? Is that where the war on Christmas is? It's more than a war on Christmas, it's a war on culture there. What's that? War on freedom, yeah. Any other comments? Well, anyway, thank you all for coming. And I hope I got to my point at the end.